Let's bring on New York Times bestselling author Monte Burke, who's going to join the show and talk about his newest book, because you got a bunch of them out there, Men of Troy, The Legendary Afternoons, Wild Nights, and Enduring Legacy of Pete Carroll's USC Trojans. Monte, how you doing today, man?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me on.
So I'm fascinated by that USC team. For listeners who may not know yet, what drew you to tell this story?
I think it's one of the most intriguing eras in modern college football for sure. You had this coach who was downtrodden, had been fired twice, once by the Jets, once by the Patriots. You had this program that was, hadn't been relevant in 2 decades. They kind of got together. There's a build, there's 2 championships in a row, darn close to a third championship again in the USC Texas game, which is, considered one of the great games of all time. And, the way that they sort of captured the city of Los Angeles to me was really fascinating too. There were no NFL teams at the time there. So, Hollywood celebs love winners. These guys started winning. All of a sudden you had Snoop Dogg and Will Ferrell and the Fonz and Arnold, not just going to games, but they were like there at practice. I interviewed the punter who was there a couple of years, and he said, I'd be practicing my punts and like 3 feet away, there'd be Snoop Dogg. So you had this kind of weird, awesome kind of convergence of all these different things coming in. And then of course, from a writer's point of view, it's always good to have an arc, a natural arc. And there's a great arc there, with all the championships and the apex, and then that all crumbles in this, sordid scandal.
USC was well before Pete Carroll had glory days as well, obviously.
Absolutely.
What
Yep.
was it about when John Robinson left in the period before Pete Carroll that led to their demise so that Pete Carroll would have this opportunity?
It was just a number of things. Bringing Robinson back, right? I remember when Joe Gibbs went back to the then called the Redskins. It's like people taking a second bite of the apple usually doesn't work out. And then they just made some bad coaching hires. Not only was this Pete Carroll's probably last chance as a head coach, it was also the AD, Mike Garrett, who was the AD of USC at the time, was probably his last chance too. This was, both these guys were down to one strike, and they hit it out of the park.
This wasn't an overnight success with them. They had struggles those first few years. Was there a specific moment early in his tenure when you realized, or they realized, that USC was going to be something special?
Yeah, there was a game against Arizona, one of those late Pac-10 like wild night games, and they had they had good players, right? They had Troy Polamalu and Carson Palmer. They just weren't all putting it together, and they had a big lead, and they gave up the lead. It looked like they were going to lose, and then there was a pick six to win that game, and that sort of, he started off his first season 1-4, so people were irate when he was hired in the first place because he was like the fourth, candidate, and they were really irate when they started really poorly that year. But I think that kind of got it going, and then in the his second season there, people got a little bit better. They went to the Orange Bowl eventually. That was kind of like Carson and Troy were kind of the building blocks that, Leinart and Bush and Lendale White and those guys just pushed over the top.
Pete Carroll, as you mentioned earlier, wasn't even a success with the Jets, which is not easy to have your coach of your USC come from a guy who once is just a long line of people that didn't succeed with the Jets. What was it about this turn for Pete Carroll that he was able to switch it around?
So he's what is so fascinating. I wrote a book about Nick Saban too. So like to write about Pete Carroll is so fascinating because they are like polar opposites, right? Nick Saban's kind of the militaristic, coach, top down coach, and Carroll was very unorthodox. He grew up in the summer of love out in the Bay Area in San Francisco. He loved psychology. He was like, loved Far Eastern mysticism, all that sort of stuff. So he was a player's coach, which of course was a derogatory term back then. And so that just didn't work. When he didn't have like the true framework for all of that. So it didn't work with the Jets, who weren't very patient with him, by the way. They fired him after 1 year, and then didn't work with the Patriots, who were kind of patient with him. They waited, 3 years. Those owners of those teams just had no idea what to do with this guy, this kind of West Coast flake, and the media just ate him up. But I think, going into USC, he had a year off of football, basically. And then going into USC, he really sat down and kind of figured out this framework, how he could do all this stuff, but also have some kind of discipline around it. And, college kids are more impressionable. They're younger. Back then, they were certainly more captive. You had them for, 3 to 4 years. And so that sort of, vibe that he had of all that psychology and all that sort of stuff, and also making it fun. He believed that like peak performance came from having fun. And I can't tell you how many people I interviewed who said, he made it players, former players. He said he made it like, I felt like I was 12 years old in my backyard again, playing touch football. So, there's this, it just worked there. I mean, he finally proved that this thing could work. And then of course it would work later on at the Seahawks as well.
You made a statement that seems so far long ago. Forgive my speaking. That you had players captive in college for 4 years.
I know, isn't that crazy?
Just think about that. That's it. That was the glory days of like 5 years ago.
Very different.
Could Pete Carroll make it in this environment?
In this, I think
you don't have the captive. You don't have the ability to have them trust you. It takes time to do what Pete Carroll does as far as develop that kind of trust.
I think if he was younger, and then I think if you took this era and put it back, again, you go back to Los Angeles at the time, the Lakers weren't that good at the time. The Dodgers weren't that good. No NFL teams. This was, one of the reasons that they brought the whole program down is because they felt like it was an unfair recruiting advantage to have Will Ferrell come to your practice. Or imagine if you're like a high school recruit and you go there and like Snoop's there, you're like, I'll probably go here. Plus they had access to all the clubs. And they went out with Paris Hilton and Britney Spears and all sorts of stuff. So I think if you could somehow bottle that and put that in this era, then he might have some success. Again, he'd have to be younger. I don't imagine a 74-year-old, really having a great time with this new era right now. I mean, look at Saban. The minute this era sort of dawned, he said, great knowing you. See you later.
You talk about the players practicing with superstars that have bigger names next to them. How did that shape the identity of those teams? And Carroll embracing that, how did he balance discipline with freedom for these high-profile elite athletes?
So he loved, most coaches, especially everywhere, NFL and big-time college programs, close practices, right? I don't want some spy coming in and like looking at my plays, whatever. He said, forget that. Anyone can come. And so all of a sudden you had, school kids coming, parents of the players coming, but also celebrities coming, right? And he loved that. I mean, he loved the fact that Matt Leinart would have a 4th and 7 in practice and Arnold would be sitting right over his shoulder right there. I mean, that you had that kind of, if you could perform under that pressure, the Orange Bowl would be no problem. That was his philosophy anyway. And, when he got there, he was so desperate really for success that he kind of put his ego aside. And he hired an incredible staff of not only great recruiters, great player developers, but also the ball busters. I mean, so he didn't have to be the strict disciplinarian. He had guys like Ed Orgeron, who was the famous defensive line coach who would go on to win a national title at LSU. He was kind of his bad cop, right? So he would keep all the kids kind of, if they missed classes or whatever, he was the one who got them out running at 5 a.m. So he could be kind of the good cop while his assistants were the bad cops, which is a total inversion of the usual, the way it usually goes. I mean, usually Saban's chewing out a player and then an assistant would come over and be like, yeah, this is what he meant. It's okay. But this was totally, the whole thing was sort of inverted at USC. But again, he loved all that vibe and that hype, and he just loved, he really like cultivated it, right? It became this incredible recruiting mechanism for one.
Was it artificial or was that really just him?
It's really, when I first met him, I was like, this guy he can't be real, right? Like there's no way that this is like this positive and this energetic stuff like that, and I met him when he was in his 70s, so it's like, and he had this incredible energy. And what you come to realize, he's a self-diagnosed ADD guy, right? And you can see that he's always like moving around, right? He's always like chewing gum and throwing a ball and doing this and doing that. And so, I think it's legit. Now, he's not, it's all done. There's a certain manipulation, psychological manipulation going on in there. Again, I go back to the good cop, bad cop thing. There's a scene in the book when Ed Orgeron is chewing out this offensive lineman who's been underperforming, and he's making the guy cry basically. And Carroll hears it and he runs over and he's like, yeah, don't you do that to that guy. Don't you do that to the guy. And the kid gets up and leaves. And then right before Carroll goes out the door, he turns around and winks at Ed. So like, there's the psychology part, plays a little role. Lendell White says that their nickname for him was Sneaky Pete. Like, he was getting his objective done through these means.
Is there like any behind the scenes stories, lesser known moments in the book that really capture the spirit of the team?
There's tons. I mean, just tons. I mean, tons when it comes to, I had 7 really long interviews with Carroll. I had lots of great interviews with Lane Kiffin, pretty much got all the people to tell me like what's going on. So it was cool to see the behind the scenes thing about like the Bush push, for instance, and like how that play was kind of called, what went into it, how they had practiced it before. And then, there's just lots of funny little anecdotes from behind the scenes. Like there's speaking of the celebrity thing, there's a one scene, one of my favorites is after practice one day, Will Ferrell and Matt Leinart go to lunch, and a student comes up and he gets Matt Leinart's autograph. And so, I mean, which speaks to a little bit about, there was a point when Bush and Leinart were sort of, as famous, and in Leinart's case, sometimes more famous than some of the celebrities who came to see them. But, just great fun. I mean, for me anyway, such fun stuff to go through, like the Texas game, for instance, and like go through the decisions made there, to talk to the offensive coordinator, sorry, for Texas, and see what he was calling on those last plays when Vince Young scored the touchdown. I mean, that kind of stuff. I just eat that stuff up. I love, I'm a football junkie, so I love all that stuff.
To me, the fascinating part when you read a book like this, and for you, when you write a book like this, is all the people that you're interviewing. It's not just the subject; it's the subjects of the subject.
Yeah, exactly.
You just mentioned you had the opportunity to talk with Lane Kiffin. What was that like? What did you learn from him, and what did he learn from Pete?
I think Lane's fascinating. So when I interviewed him, he was still at Ole Miss, and I went down there, and he's just such a he's a nepo baby, right? I mean, we forget this sometimes too, but his father was Monte Kiffin, who was briefly the head coach at NC State, but for the most part, a lifelong assistant defensive coordinator.
Great one.
And a great one, and the guy who kind of came up with the Tampa 2 defense. So, and Carroll hired him kind of as a favor, right? But Lane brought a lot to the table. He wasn't necessarily always mature back then, and even now, but he brought a lot to the table as an offensive innovator, as a great recruiter. I mean, he got guys. He started pulling guys out of New Jersey and Florida and stuff like that USC had never gotten. And going down to interview him was just fascinating. So, going to his office, he had just gotten out of hot yoga. He had a yellow lab. He had a yellow lab running up and down the corridor and thing. And he's Lane is such an interesting guy because his 3 main mentors, one being his father, who's a defensive guy, one being Pete Carroll, who's also a defensive guy, and then the other one being Nick Saban, who's also a defensive guy, right? So you got this, and he's an offensive guy, right? So he's got these really kind of strange mentorship. Now I think he's taken a lot from Pete Carroll. And I think those USC years were really, really formative because, as he described Carroll in the book, he describes him as is kind of an oddity as a defensive coordinator, because most defensive coordinators are sort of very serious, buttoned up kind of guys. And this guy was really creative and really charismatic. So sort of wasn't like a defensive coordinator at all. So I think he's taken a lot from all these different guys. Of course, 2 months after I interviewed, or 3 months after I interviewed Lane, maybe 4 months, maybe, he takes off to LSU, but not surprising either,
I was going to say, that probably wasn't surprising after talking to him.
Not at all.
Few dynasties exist without controversy. Obviously, this one had plenty of it. In your view, how much did the pressure to win at the level they were at and the access that so many people had to the program contribute to ultimately what happened at USC? And how did the players and staff reconcile the joy of the era with how it ended?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, there's to a certain degree, the greatest strength of that program, which was its sort of, hype and available and vibe and the celebrities there and ability to get all these great players, kind of became its biggest weakness too. I mean, it got kind of out of control. I mean, there's a scene in the book when one of the defensive coordinator comes down after a practice or something like that, and it's almost like when Jesus supposedly cleared the money lenders out of the temple. He comes down and gets all these agents, you're cockroaches, get out of here, So it got to a point where it's a little bit out of control, and which allowed things like the Reggie Bush scandal to happen, but also kind of contributed to the fact that they had incredible teams in 06, 07, and 08, and didn't compete for a national title. And then, of course, it all comes crumbling down in the Reggie Bush scandal, which was a very odd scandal and a very cool thing to kind of look back on now, because I think it precipitated, some of the changes that we've seen in college football. I mean, here was Reggie Bush, the most electric player in college football, captivated a whole city, and made gobs of money for USC and for college football and for all the networks, and yet was legally not allowed to make any money. So, it's funny in talking to some of the USC folks that one of the great questions is, was it all worth it, right? Was this era worth what happened afterwards? Because they really haven't been a relevant program since then. I mean, this season, they seemed to get a little bit better, but they really haven't been nationally relevant as they were ever since, that Texas game.
It seems to me a national championship is worth it. To me, the question would be, was the aftermath something that was worthy of the punishment that they had? Did you get any impression from talking to Pete Carroll that he's at all bitter about that this is part of his lasting legacy?
I start the last chapter with him bemoaning the fact that this will always be part of his legacy, right? That a large majority, maybe not a majority, but a large number of people will always think that he left, that he scooted when he saw the bad weather coming in. And so, that, yes, I mean, so it's a big cloud. And what's interesting also about the scandal is how hard the NCAA came down on them. And you have to remember that Reggie was allegedly being paid not to stay and play for USC. He was being paid to leave USC. And, the NCAA came down extremely hard on them, led by a guy who used to be was once the athletic director at University of Miami. Penn State, University of Miami had scandals afterwards. The Nevin Shapiro one at Miami, and then of course the Sandusky scandal at Penn State. And neither of those punishments came close to what USC had. So I think in some ways, I mean, like I said before, it kind of precipitated the changes we have in another way too, because I think the hypocrisy of the NCAA was sort of laid bare after that.
Looking at college football today with NIL, transfer portal, realignment, could a dynasty like that exist again, do you think?
I mean, it's so funny. I was thinking about this the other day. I mean, it used to be, I feel like, I mean, I think there's always been like a little bit of cheating in college football, like players being paid and stuff. In fact, I have in this book, players admitting that they got some money. But to me, the best programs of that era were the ones that recruited the best and then developed the best players. Now, recruiting is kind of like, it matters a lot less now than it used to, right? I mean, it's like I look at Indiana. It's like very few of those players have been recruited to that team. Miami, you can say the same thing. I mean, they got the quarterback from Georgia. So I think it's going to be really hard to, when you get portal players, you don't have much time to kind of develop them and get them in the scheme and all that kind of stuff. So I think it's going to be very hard to have. I think you'll have teams like Georgia and Ohio State, which will remain really, really good. But in terms of a title-winning dynasties, it's going to be a lot harder now than it used to be, unless they change this somehow and put a salary cap on it or something like that.
You've chosen two amazing subjects for books in Saban and Carroll.
Yep.
As you pointed out, they're very different, but their success is similar.
Yep.
Did you find any threads, even though on the outside they look so different, that there are similarities between these two men?
Yeah, I mean, I think attention to detail would be one thing. I mean, the Saban is known as the process, right? I mean, he just loved. He paid attention to everything, and he loved the minutia of football. And Carroll, even despite his kind of loosey-goosey demeanor, was also like really honed in on the details. He would figure out what people, what the kitchen staff should make players for a nutritious and a lunch that would give them more energy. He prepared them for things like, he would do things that would seem kind of loosey-goosey. Like there was one practice that was going terribly, and he said, let's all get on the buses, and they went to the beach and they watched a professional beach volleyball tournament or something like that. But then they came immediately back and started practicing again. And so what seemed like maybe a little vacation from practice was actually a chance for him to teach them how to refocus, right? So both of them were just, so sort of have blinders on the outside world and just completely, focused on just the minutia of what builds and what makes a great football team.
Before we wrap up, for fans who lived through the era or younger people who are just discovering it now, what do you hope they take away from this book?
I mean, I think it's an era that's bygone at this point, right? I mean, it's like there won't be an era like this again, and especially there won't be a time when a team, college football is sort of a small town sport. You think of Tuscaloosa and State College and all that stuff, but there's like USC was in Los Angeles, right? And it was this moment. It was kind of before social media, but TMZ was up and, Us Weekly and all this sort of stuff. So it had this like, it's just this crazy moment that I don't think it never happened before. And I think there's no chance it'll ever happen again. And so to me, it's just a really fascinating look back on something that was really unique and really intriguing in this sport that's been changed quite rapidly.
Hollywood's still there. LA's still there. Why can't they, especially now that money's involved, why can't USA get back there?
I think you got two professional teams there now, right? That's a
well, kind of.
They fill the vacuum. No, I know. I mean, maybe if they start winning, I just don't see. I also don't think that it would be allowed. I mean, I think the sort of one of the takeaways of the sanctions was that they couldn't open their practices anymore, right? So I think it just wouldn't be. I don't know. I don't think it could happen again. I really don't. I think this was a kind of a singular moment that everything kind of came together. The right coach, the program that gave them the keys because they said do whatever you want to make us successful again. The filling the right vacuum. To me, it was kind of a unique thing.
All right, last thing for me. Does it ever get old being introduced as New York Times bestseller?
Never. Never.
We'll hope.
What's the next bestseller? Do you already have your next target lined up?
I do. I'm going to keep it under wraps for right now, but I do. Oh yeah.
Well,
I can't wait. But now it's like next couple of weeks, so it's all about this, and then we move on. But
well, we can't wait to follow this and see how big it goes. And when you get your next topic, we hope we get to talk to you about that. The book is Men of Troy: The Legendary Afternoons, Wild Nights, and Enduring Legacy of Pete Carroll's USC Trojans. Monte Burke, thanks so much for the time, man.
Thanks for having me on, guys.